We are starting the webinar. Great to see you all on this Friday morning. We're going to give it a couple more moments to let people log on and get settled in anticipation of a great meeting here for the California Aging and Disability Research Partnership meeting, or we call it CADRP, C-A-D-R-P. Okay. Let's go to the next slide, please, Callie. Hello, my name is Carol DeAndres. I am the manager, the MPA stakeholder and public engagement manager here at the Master Plan for Aging team at the California Department of Aging. We welcome you to the California Aging and Disability Research Partnership meeting, or CADRP, C-A-D-R-P is what we call it. Today is July 19th, 2024, and this is the committee's third and final general meeting for 2024. These folks are awfully busy all year round, but this is the final meeting of the CADRP for 2024. So next slide, please. Let's go over some logistics as we all get settled. This is a webinar functions, and we have live captioning available through the Zoom webinar functions. The meeting slides, transcript, and recording will be posted to the California Health and Human Services, or CalHHS agency webpage for the Master Plan for Aging, the webpage for CADRP. So please check it out in a week or so. And for our committee members and panelists and guests, if you haven't already, please change your name, update your name in the Zoom display by clicking the upper right-hand corner of your video and selecting rename. And to your name, right now it just says CADRP panelist. So we'd like to know who's joined us today. Next slide, please. Let's go over some virtual meeting operations. The chat function is enabled for committee members, CDA staff to share meeting related resources and information, and the public's able to view the content shared in the chat during the meeting. The question and answer functions are not enabled. The chat and question and answer functions are not enabled for comments and questions from the public attendees, but we do invite you to make public comment during the public comment period at the later part of the agenda. Please hold your comments until that time. As always, you can send your public comments at any time to our Engage email box, which is engage@aging.ca.gov. Next slide. Our public comment logistics. Attendees joining by phone can press *9 on the dial pad. It will raise a hand and we'll go ahead and unmute your line. And for attendees joining by the webinar function, Zoom, click the raised hand button to join the queue, and we'll announce your name and unmute your line. And do note, we limit the public comments to 2 minutes so that we can ensure time for everyone. And again, at any time, you can send your public comment to engage@aging.ca.gov. Next slide. The primary purpose of the California Aging and Disability Research Partnership, CADRP, is to, 1, advance age and disability-focused research to strengthen the evidence base for promoting equitable opportunities for Californians to thrive as they age. Number 2, to provide input on key performance indicators and data sources to inform MPA outcomes reports and the data dashboard for aging. And 3, model a research partnership between California state government and academic institutions focused on using data for action and equity that can be replicated across other CalHHS person-centered, data-driven priorities. And we couldn't do this without our esteemed committee members As you can see, we have individuals from academia, from philanthropic organizations, sharing their knowledge and their expertise. And we are very fortunate to lean upon these individuals to advance the master plan for aging. So thank you very much for taking your time and giving it to us, not only today, but throughout the year. So this is a brief review of our agenda today. We have a lot to get through, data related agenda items. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our director, Susan DeMorris, to give us a welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you all of our CDA staff who pulled today's agenda and slides together. And welcome everyone. It's good to see you this Friday morning. You have such a good agenda today. I'm so excited that you'll be hearing from Dr. Cashel, my colleague on the Interagency Council on Homelessness now. And Margot, just your work is living proof how data can inform policy. And I can tell you 2 years ago, no one was talking about older adult homelessness. And now I serve on the National Alzheimer's Project Act, and I was asked to do a segment at the August 3rd meeting following on Dr. Cushel's presentation to that group. And it's just, you know, the work that you do, I just want to, I want you to know it's so important, and that we're able for the first time in the history of California's aging and disability movement to be able to point to data in lots of fronts. Housing and homelessness is just one area. And I just really want to thank each of you for participating in CATERB, for the expertise that you bring, the ideas that you bring, the outcomes you produce. We're so incredibly, incredibly proud of the LGBTQIA plus survey and report, and the work that will follow on, that it's not just a one and done, that it's resulting in even more work and focus groups. And we really expect that to produce tangible results for real people in California. Since we last met, the budget has passed, and it was much more favorable than it started out. So I want to thank each of you that had a hand in that, and all of the advocacy by our aging and disability partners, our academic partners. In our piece of the world, senior nutrition was preserved. That's critically, critically important, but there are countless examples of proposed cuts that were not enacted. And the master plan for aging is a big part of why so many programs and services were preserved in the budget. Your work, the work of our other stakeholder committees, the legislature now knows and understands the 5 bold goals. They know that we have a 10-year blueprint for our state. Legislative staff, legislative analyst staff, finance staff can go to our data dashboard, and they can pull up, they can use data to inform decisions, put it in their committee analysis. So your work is really, what's the word? Not penetrating, but it's proliferating. Your work is proliferating. And then the last piece that I will share is earlier this week, once a year, the governor and the first partner in the cabinet convene all of the state leaders. And the meeting happened this week. And we got to hear from the governor, the first partner, all of our cabinet secretaries. Our work is so much of our work is in the health and human services space, the labor and workforce development agency, the business consumer services and housing. We work primarily with 3 cabinet secretaries, but all the cabinet secretaries were part of this. And the one group that I thought of repeatedly as the governor, first partner, cabinet leaders, keynote speakers addressed us was this group. I thought we are on the mark. The call for data-driven solutions and strategies for key outcomes, performance measures, and results. People first. person-centered work. I really thought of CATER time and time again throughout that day as the one group that's really helping to bridge departments, programs, departments, agencies, and commissions. This is really the group where it all comes together, and we're just incredibly, incredibly grateful for what you're doing for the state of California as members of CATERP. And very excited to see what you come up with for your priorities for the day of action. I hope I'll see every one of you there in person. And that's what I've got for my state update. And Carol, I'll turn it back over to you.
I'm going to turn it over to Ross.
Thank you, Carol. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. The first item is the upcoming day of action. We're about 2.5 months away from the actual day of action, so want to provide some context on what to expect that day. And Jackie Tompkins is going to kick things off, and I'll provide this an overview of the recommendations we discussed last meeting. So Jackie, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Ross. Good morning, CATER. My name is Jackie Tompkins. I serve as the project director here at the California Department of Aging for the Master Plan for Aging. I'm thrilled to be able to join you this morning to talk a little bit about the California for All Ages and Abilities 2024 MPA Day of Action happening this October. I believe I was able to join your last meeting back in April, where we told you to save the date for October 8th. Here in Sacramento, and likely you've received subsequent communications encouraging you all to register for the event. So if you have not already, I do want to take this opportunity while you all are on the line to do one more plug to ensure that you A, have the event on your calendar, and B, know where to register for the event here in Sacramento. And before I move forward, I do want to also thank our MPA philanthropic partners for supporting this event. Without their support, it would be incredibly challenging to be able to put on this wide level statewide event. Callie, can you advance the slide? So just want to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be doing at the Day of Action. Some of you might have attended the last Day of Action in 2022, but some of you might have been in a different role at that time, or maybe were a virtual attendee or didn't attend at all. But really, this Day of Action is an opportunity for us to bring together our MPA stakeholder committees, public members, stakeholders, and partners that might not be formally on a committee, and also decision makers at the administration level, as well as the legislature. And it's an opportunity for us to think about and reflect on the progress we've made to date on California's Master Plan for Aging, but also to ensure that the Master Plan remains responsive to new information as we progress through our 10-year blueprint. It's also an opportunity for us to develop and refresh new initiatives to focus on in California for the next 2 years. And so the primary purposes of this event are outlined on this slide, in which we want to ensure that we are focusing on the work on the highest priority issues facing older adults, people with disabilities, and caregivers in California today. It's really important that we also ground our Master Plan for Aging on lived experience and focus on equity. And this will be a time that we gather priority recommendations from all the stakeholder committees to, again, inform the development of California's Master Plan for Aging initiatives for the next 2 years. This is also a time for us to, again, highlight what progress has been made to date, because there are opportunities here to celebrate those successes and highlight the advancements that the Master Plan for Aging has made relative to its 5 bold goals. And also moving forward, it's that opportunity to renew our shared commitment to California's Master Plan for Aging. We are at that halfway point with California's Master Plan for Aging. So again, important to reflect on the success to date, but understand that the work is definitely not done. But what can we do in the next 2 years to further advance California's blueprint? And then furthermore, it again is that opportunity to engage diverse partners in the Master Plan for Aging. The Master Plan for Aging is, as you heard from Susan, is that whole of government approach. And it's also a whole of society, whole of community approach. So here in California, we are able to put on this event to model to not only those within our state, but even we're inviting some national leaders with aging and disability to join us so they can see what is happening in California. They can hear directly from partners and stakeholders about priority issues happening in California. Because we are all very interested not only in making California age and disability friendly, but our nation and global and beyond. So it really is that opportunity to invite diverse partners across all levels of government, nonprofits, community-based organizations, academia, et cetera, to really have robust discussions about priority topics. Moving on to the next slide. Do I have a next slide, Rob? I'm trying to think
I
on
think
this
the
one.
next slide is mine. I just want to discuss the recommendations we discussed last partnership meeting. I think the really thoughtful, robust discussion in terms of the research partnerships priorities and priorities we want to bring forward for the day of action. So the key themes are listed on the slide here. We discussed focusing on making our research more relevant to people. This is important as we obviously want our research to inform policy. So data storytelling came up several times. Using qualitative data to effectively tell stories came up. Amplifying lessons learned was important. I think essentially we want our research to have a wide reach, but not be overly complex, be presented as a story. And this is powerful when thinking about really impactful research that is widely understood. So that was our first recommendation we discussed last meeting. Also, several of the partnership members discussed focusing upstream on actual barriers, right? So we focus primarily on drivers, what's causing these issues, whether it's homelessness, psychological distress, burdens faced by caregivers. That's more reactionary. It's really important, but it's more reactionary. So I think we like to better address and understand what's getting in the way of folks earlier in these processes. So focusing on prevention is an important recommendation. We also talked about causal inference and the importance of it. So we're better informed about the magnitude or degree of what's causing these issues that we're studying. This recommendation also gets that they need to integrate different types of data sets because these issues are multifaceted, but also interconnected, right? So it's a good segue to the last bullet because we want to look at intersections. As I just mentioned, these issues are interconnected. So we can't look at these issues in silos. So going forward, something we'd like to see is more integration of data sets again, when possible, but taking a more holistic approach with these issues as well. And so I think those are essentially the different recommendations we discussed last meeting, what we want to bring forward. But I'll open up for Q&A here. So if you have other recommendations for consideration, if you have comments on these recommendations, please feel free. If you have questions for Jackie on the actual day of action, this is our opportunity to discuss. So we'll open it up now, and you can raise your hand or just hop right in.
While folks are formulating some questions and comments to, the recommendations that CADARP wants to move forward with, I just wanted to highlight that on the day of action, all MPA stakeholder committees will have that opportunity to verbally present and share your formal recommendations to those in attendance, as well as it will be virtually streamed. So I just wanted to highlight that CADARP will have space on the agenda to share their recommendations along with the other MPA stakeholder committees.
There might not be any questions. That's totally fine too. So that's okay. Thank you, Jackie. So I think we can move on to the next agenda item. We get to go? Okay. Dr. Kushel, thank you so much for joining today. So Dr. Kushel is going to present on the Hope Home study. So really excited about that. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Dr. Kushel.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for inviting me. And I'm going to present both on our data on older adults from the Hope Home study and also from the California statewide study of people experiencing homelessness. And we recently also produced a report on focus on older adults from that. And all of those are available on our website. I am Margaret Kushel. I direct the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative, as well as something called the Center for Vulnerable Populations, where we are switching the name in a few weeks to the Action Center for Action Research Center for Health Equity at UCSF. Next slide. I just think it's important before we launch into any discussion of homelessness to just call out and name that homelessness is an issue of racial injustice. And just a brief reminder to everyone that in our nation, home ownership has been the primary means of intergenerational wealth building, that until very recently in our collective history, there has been legal, amoral, unethical, and frankly racist, but legal discrimination in home ownership operating through racial covenants, leading to segregated neighborhoods and the practice of redlining, which restricted access to mortgages in segregated neighborhoods. And even though this has been illegal since the fair housing laws were passed in the late 1960s, we still live in neighborhoods that are really derived from those practices. Even though it's no longer legal, we see lots of ongoing discrimination through the predatory lending crisis in 2008, which particularly impacted older adults from racially minoritized groups. We still see illegal but clear ongoing discrimination on the basis of race in our rental markets. And you add that to well-described discrimination, criminal justice, employment, and educational discrimination, it is perhaps not a surprise that Black Americans are at 3- to 4-fold increased risk of homelessness. As someone racialized as white, I think it's very important that I always mention this in every talk. Okay, next slide. So as some grounding, the population of people experiencing homelessness is aging. And just to put a number on it, our research showed that in the early 1990s, approximately 11% of homeless single adults. So this is excluding, moms and homeless families and the very young adults, but the vast majority of the population are single adults. 1990, 11% were 50 and older. 2003. 32% were 50 and older. That data is from San Francisco. And then in our statewide study, which we published last year, we now know that across California, 48% of homeless single adults are now 50 and older. Next slide. Oops, if you can just click through these. Yeah, thank you. Next slide. Okay, this is a generational effect. From work by Dennis Culhane and others, we know that Americans born in the second half of the baby boom, so about 1955 to 1965, have had an elevated risk of homelessness throughout their lifetime. Dennis, after we published that study about the 1990s to early 2003, Dennis went into nationwide shelter records, looked at men to try to isolate sort of single adults from homeless families, and found this bubble effect. So that 1 of 8 male shelter residents in 1990 were 31 to 33, 1 in 5. You can see this bubble, right? So there's this big bubble of people, 31 to 33 in the 1990s. Under the orange line, a big bubble of people in their early 40s. Under the blue line, a big bubble of people late 40s, early 50s in 2010, and that is increasing. These correspond to people born in the second half of the baby boom. This sort of makes sense, right? This is a group of people we know if you're born in the second half of the baby boom, you always sort of lose out on employment opportunities because like the first half took them. This is a group of people who came of age during huge changes in criminal justice policy, so got really caught up in the war on drugs. This is a group of people who entered the job market during a recession. We know if you do that, you never make up the lost income. And most importantly, this is a group of people who enter the housing market at a time of huge changes in federal support for affordable housing, leaving them at a structural disadvantage the rest of their lives. Next slide. We project that this trend will continue. This is from, again, Dr. Culhane, Dennis Culhane's work, who showed that looking at people 65 and older, the proportion experiencing homelessness across several major cities in the US, including LA, is anticipated to triple between 2017 and 2030. This group of people experiencing homelessness 65 and up has the fastest rise in this time period. Next slide. I'm going to present work from 2 studies toward a new understanding, the California statewide study of people experiencing homelessness. We published this last June. This is a statewide study, representative sample of adults experiencing homelessness throughout the state of California. We use mixed methods. More recently, we published our report on older adults. Next slide. I'm also going to talk about results from the Hope Home study, the health outcomes of people experiencing homelessness in older middle age. This is an NIH-funded study that has been ongoing in Oakland since 2013, looking specifically at adults 50 and older. Everyone in this study was homeless when we enrolled them, but we followed them for the last 14 years or so, or however long it's been, a long time, 10 years. And we follow them regardless of whether they remain homeless, enter housing, or go, as most people do, in and out. Next slide. In the California statewide study, to put a number on the racial inequity, this is looking at those 50 and older. So now I'm looking at people 50 and older across the state. Of those 50 and older across the state, 31% of people experiencing homelessness who are 50 and older in California report a Black racial identity versus 6% of the overall state population of people 50 and older. 3% of those 50 and older report a Native American Indigenous identity versus 0.3% statewide. 14% of those 50 and older report a multiracial identity versus 3% statewide. And there's actually an underrepresentation of Latinx population because the Latinx homeless population tends to be much younger. In the younger population, there's an overrepresentation. In the older population, there is a underrepresentation having to do with generational trend. Next slide. The homeless population is aging. This is a statewide adults. The first is all adults, whether they're in families, very young adults, older adults. The median age of every adult experiencing homelessness across our state is now 47. The range of 18, which was our lowest amount, to 89 was the oldest person we recruited. Amongst those single adults, as I said, 48% were 50 plus. Among adults, all adults who are 50 and older, 41% had never been homeless, not even for one night, before the age of 50. This is from the California statewide study of people experiencing homelessness. Amazingly, this matches within 1 percentage point to what we have found in Oakland in the Hope Home study. So I have a lot of confidence in this number. Next slide. There are real differences among older adults experiencing homelessness between those who became homeless before 50 and remained homeless and those who first entered homelessness after the age of 50. So this is just looking at people who are homeless and older adults and comparing those who had been homeless before 50 to those after 50. So again, amongst older adults experiencing homelessness. If you look at the older adults experiencing homelessness who were homeless at some point before the age of 50 and either remained homeless after 50 or became homeless again after 50, compared to those who are newly homeless after 50, we see a much higher prevalence of severe adverse early life experiences, leading to low income attainment in older adulthood, much more likely to have no spouse or partner, much more likely to report significant mental health problems, alcohol use problems, traumatic brain injury, and imprisonment. Next slide. If you look among those older adults who first became homeless after 50, again, about 41% of all older adults, what you see is a very different story. These were people who worked throughout their adult lives, usually more than one job, but in physically demanding low-wage work until sometime after the age of 50, they had an identifiable crisis. These folks, when telling us their life history, could say, and then, in June of 2019, like they were able to pinpoint an event. And those events really fell into one of 4 buckets. Either they or their spouse or partner lost a job, they or their spouse or partner had a marital breakdown. So they and their spouse or partner marital breakdown, they became ill, or their spouse or partner became ill, their spouse or partner died, or their parent died. A lot of stories of like a 53-year-old man whose 78-year-old mom with whom they were living passed, and they suddenly then had no access to either her share of the housing support, like her share of the rent, or their name wasn't on the lease and they had no title to the house. What we found was an incredible lack of both advocacy and social support. By advocacy, we meant many of them were not exercising legal rights. If they had, on paper, they might have had legal rights, let's say, to not be evicted, but they had no way of knowing that, and they didn't seek help with that because they were unaware. Social support was interesting. It wasn't so much that people didn't have social support, it's that they didn't exercise their social support because of such shock and shame and the stigma of becoming homeless. Many of these elder adults told us that their families, let's say, still didn't know that they were homeless and that they were doing a lot to hide it. Next slide. Going back to the California statewide study, how did older adults enter homelessness? 19% of older adults entered homelessness directly from an institutional setting. This included long-term jail stays and prison stays, but also among older adults, quite a big proportion that came from health institutions, nursing homes, drug treatment centers, and the like. 36% entered from housing in what we called a non-leaseholding arrangement. So older adults who were doubled up with family or friends, but had no legal title. The importance of this is that these are people for whom at that moment, eviction protection laws wouldn't protect them because they had no legal rights to their housing. And 35% of the older adults entered directly from a housing arrangement from which they held legal rights. Next slide. Among homeless Californians 50 and older, the median monthly household income in the 6 months prior to homelessness was a mere $920 a month. Among non-leaseholders, again, this is among older adults, the median monthly household income was $996. It's higher than $920 because some of those were the institutional folks who had really low incomes. Among those non-leaseholders, 42% were paying no rent. But of those who did pay rent, the median rent was $412 a month. Among the leaseholders, the median monthly household income was $1,100 a month. This is sort of like an SSI kind of range here, but the median monthly rent was $659 a month. So two things: if your household income is $1,100 a month, you can't really sustain $659 a month, but also there's no place in our state that you can re-enter the housing market for as low as $659 a month. Next slide. This is one of our participants, older participants, saying, so I've given my whole checkup many times just to pay my rent. Yeah, I would prefer to go broke paying my rent than to go broke and have not have nothing at all. Even if it costs me my whole SSI check, I don't care. As long as my rent gets paid, that's all I care. My bills, my lights, I don't care. Everyone was sort of juggling everything to make their rent and then eventually couldn't do so. Next slide. Where did older adults spend their time? Among people 50 and older across our state, 79% spent the majority of their nights in the prior 6 months in an unsheltered setting, 21% in a vehicle and 58% in a non-vehicle setting, looking a lot like this, which is a picture we took during our research. Only 21% of older adults spent the majority of their last 6 months sheltered. And I will say that this was the same as the population overall, that older adults were no more likely to be sheltered than younger homeless adults. Next slide. Among those 50 or older, their health was really terrible. So 50 and older experiencing homelessness, 53% statewide reported their health as fair or poor, very similar, by the way, to what we found in Hope Home. 68% reported at least one major chronic health condition, even though we assume that these were underreported because people had such poor access to care. These are things like diabetes, congestive heart failure, a stroke, or a major cancer diagnosis. 35% reported having at least 2 chronic health conditions. Next slide. Among older adults, 43% reported difficulty with one or more of the 5 major activities of daily living limitations. Next slide. 23% of older adults reported 3 or more ADL limitations, obviously normally thought of as meeting criteria for nursing home care. Next slide. Going back to the Hope Home data, so these are adults 50 and older, median age of 57, 26% had moderate to severe impairment on a screening test for global cognitive impairment. This is on a 3Ms test. Next slide. 35% had moderate to severe impairment on a screening test for executive function, the TRAILS-B. This is important because when we ask older adults to manage homelessness, we make enormous demands on people's executive function. You know, if you want to get your housing subsidy, you need to go to the DMV and get your license, and then you need to come here. Like, people just can't do it. We're asking people something that really is not within what they could do. Next slide. Across, this is again back to Hope Home, but very similar in CASPA, 27% mobility impairment. 34% had had one or more falls in the prior 6 months. 45% had a best measured vision with their glasses on, meeting criteria for significant visual impairment. 36% had hearing impairments, and 48% were experiencing urinary incontinence. Imagine trying to get a job, find housing, if you have no place to do laundry, no place to get fresh clothes, and you're experiencing urinary incontinence. Next slide. This leads us to say that when we're talking about homelessness, 50 is a new 75. In both studies, with a median age of people 50 and older of about 57 or 58, people had the level of geriatric conditions, function, and health status that is worse than what we see in the general population of people in their 70s or 80s. Next slide. We saw incredible barriers on the basis of disability to accessing even homeless shelters. One of the reasons why we didn't see a higher proportion sheltered than we saw of younger adults is that there are a lot of age-related actual lack of ability for shelters to manage people. So they kicked them out and they slept on the street. This is one of our participants talking. A lot of shelters, they're not equipped for disabilities, for handicapped, disabled, They don't have handrails in the showers. They don't have a ramp, The disability can be a problem. They don't accept us in a lot of shelters. I'm seeing more and more older adults telling us that they are turned away from shelters because they are too impaired for the shelter to manage them. And so instead they are sleeping outside on the sidewalk, where they are then subject to homelessness sweeps and other policing. Next slide. Among older adults, this is going back to CASPA, very similar in Hope Home, we saw a high level of mental health symptomatology, but it was really driven by depressive symptoms and anxiety. So 63% of older adults had some significant mental health symptomatology, 46% with anxiety symptoms, 44% with depressive symptoms, but over a third reported trouble remembering, concentrating, or understanding. This can be a sign of severity, let's say, of depressive symptoms. It can be representing dementia. It can be representing ADHD. It could be representing a thought disorder or others. 13% of older adults reported currently experiencing hallucinations. Again, could be a primary psychotic disorder, could be secondary to substance use, or could be a side effect of depression, which we know in older adults is more likely to have hallucinations as a part of the depressive disorder picture. Next slide. We looked among older adults at measures of behavioral health complexity, thinking this is a population that would likely need behavioral health support in their housing exit, something like permanent supportive housing with behavioral health support. Among all older adults, 43% reported a complex behavioral need. Interestingly, this is lower than in younger homeless adults. We did this by either current regular illicit drug use, heavy episodic alcohol use, so binge drinking at least weekly, current hallucinations, or report of a recent mental health hospitalization. 43% of older adults had at least one of those 4 measures of severe behavioral complexity. Next slide. There is a wide overlap between behavioral health complexity and geriatric conditions. And we know that the older adult system is really not very well set up to care for people with behavioral health complexity. And the behavioral health system is completely overwhelmed by people who have age-related disability. So 22% of all older adults had both what we call the complex behavioral health need, as described before, and at least one ADL limitation. Next slide. Violence was constant, traumatic, and really a regular part of people's lives. 28% of older adults had experienced a physical attack during their current episode of homelessness. Of those older adults who experienced physical violence, 59% said it was perpetrated by a stranger. So a stranger, as opposed to both an intimate partner, acquaintance, or someone they recognize. Stranger is like someone who wasn't even from, someone who they even knew from around their encampment, 59%. This just demonstrates how vulnerable older adults are when they're experiencing homelessness. Next slide. 6% of older homeless adults had experienced a sexual assault during the current episode. Among cisgender women, it was 12% of older cisgender women. Of those who experienced a sexual assault, 75% said it was perpetrated by a stranger. Next slide. In the prior 6 months, 37% of older adults had visited the emergency department. 25% had been hospitalized for at least one night for a physical health condition, and 5% for a mental health hospitalization. Next slide. When we ask people what kept them from becoming housed, and by the way, this idea that homeless people don't want to be housed, there may be someone out there who that is true for, but in our statewide study, we couldn't find that person. Everyone wants to be housed. But the major barrier was, of course, the cost of housing. 86% said it was a significant barrier to their ability to become housed, most of them saying it was a major barrier. Next slide. But older adults talked about other barriers as well. Experiencing discrimination, often on the basis of race, 41%. Not having the necessary documents, 44%. People talked about not having any proof of who they were, proof of income, rental records, or anything, most because they're outside, things are being thrown out, and they can't get into housing. 33% noted having a record with the criminal justice system. Again, we are arresting people and jailing them for being homeless. That record then makes it hard for them to get back into housing. 44% said problems with their credit or past evictions. The irony, of course, if you have an eviction on your record, you can't get back into housing. And among older adults, almost a third noted that the housing that they could identify did not meet their needs for accessibility. So just like we saw in lack of access to shelter, we're seeing the lack of age-friendly housing presenting a major barrier to older homeless adults becoming rehoused. Next slide. Most buildings that I have been in or have been to have stairs, a lot of stairs. A lot of these apartment buildings don't have accessibility for a wheelchair or for a left leg amputee. So that's one of the major, and the money. I don't receive enough money each month to live on in my own apartment. I don't have enough income. Next slide. Going back to Hope Home, we have followed the participants since 2013. We enrolled 350 in 2013, an additional 100 in 2017, 2018. By the way, we've just enrolled another 200. But of the original 450 people, we know that 164 have already died. Again, the median age in 2013 was 57. Mortality rates are 3.1-fold higher than we would expect in Oakland for men, and 5.2%, and this is age adjusted, for women. Next slide. What were the top causes of death for older adults? Heart disease and cancer, followed by drug overdose. These mirror the major causes of death, heart disease and cancer, for older adults nationwide, but it's just shifted about 20 years earlier than we would see. But even among older adults, drug overdose or drug poisoning deaths are a common cause of death. Next slide. The population experiencing homelessness is aging. Many enter homelessness for the very first time after the age of 50. We see an early onset of geriatric conditions, including cognitive, functional, and mobility impairment. We see them much earlier than we would see in the general population. The experience of homelessness is harrowing and filled with violence and despair. Homeless systems need to be responsive to the needs of an aging population, and ending homelessness will require sustained efforts to address root causes, particularly the severe shortage of deeply affordable housing. Next slide. We make a variety of policy recommendations. Every single route towards ending this crisis, every single route. There is no way to end this without addressing access to deeply affordable housing. We need to expand targeted prevention. Prevention is very appealing. It's actually hard to do. Most prevention programs are not appropriately targeted, and most target people who probably wouldn't become homeless anyway, but there's a desperate need to get resources to people who are on the verge of homelessness. This is a population that has significant behavioral health needs, both because of inflow into homelessness, who's at highest risk, and also because of the trauma of homelessness leaves people with significant behavioral health needs. We need to recognize that and provide appropriate supports to support people in housing. We also need to recognize that people are experiencing accelerated aging, and we need to provide supports that match functional mobility and cognitive health needs. We obviously need to increase household incomes. $920 a month is just not going to cut it. We cannot leave people out there to die. And of the 79% of people who are mostly unsheltered, they felt mostly abandoned. There was no one coming for them. While housing is the answer, we can't house people who have already passed, and we definitely need to increase age-appropriate outreach and service delivery for people while they're experiencing homelessness. And by the way, we need to make sure that any interim housing measures are accessible to older adults. And finally, because of the deep, deep, deep disparities, because of the structural racism that this country swims in, we need to embed a racial equity approach in everything that we do. Next slide. This is how you reach me at our website, homelessness.ucsf.edu. You will find both the CASPA report and the Aging Homelessness report and a variety of other reports, as well as access to Hope Home papers and reports. Thank you so much. And if we have time, I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Gischel. That was really sobering findings, really powerful findings, and we do have plenty of time. Can I ask you one question about sweeps? You mentioned that word. I've been hearing that quite a bit more. It's kind of a cruel word, right? But could you just provide some context on what a sweep is and what happens to folks after sweeps, the unhoused folks?
Yeah, so sweeps is sort of like the informal word for forced displacements. Sweeps are common and going to happen more with the grants pass decision, which basically opens the door by the Supreme Court for local jurisdictions to increase sweeps. Basically, people experiencing homelessness outdoors, which is most of the population. And I just also want to warn you that most of the literature on unsheltered populations comes from New York and Boston, where 95% of the population is sheltered. So people experiencing unsheltered homelessness are very, very different, right? If you have a right to shelter in New York and you don't exercise that right, you're very different than the people who do. In California, people with more mental health disabilities and more behavioral health disabilities are more likely to be unsheltered because shelters don't take people who, let's say, who use drugs, but basically everyone else is out there also, right? It doesn't mean you have a severe mental health disability. I have plenty of patients who are like Uber drivers and 52 and have severe health problems who are living outside. So what forced displacements are people are really just not allowed to be where they are. And we observe this in real time. We observe this in real time when we're doing our research. So you're sleeping outside because you have no other place to go. A shelter won't take you. And there are, years of wait list to get into a shelter. And either the police, Caltrans, public works people, somebody comes and basically kicks you out. In some places, they give you a day's warning. In many places, although they're supposed to, they don't. They come and they basically throw away everything that you have. So they'll just pick up people's tents, pick up people's bags, and throw them out and tell you on force of arrest, you need to leave. There were 9th Circuit Court rulings that were not really completely followed, but we're there saying that jurisdictions in the 9th Circuit, which California is, we're not allowed to displace people, not allowed to arrest people, cite people or arrest people unless they could prove that they had another place to go. This was interpreted differently. The Supreme Court just threw all of that out last month in the grants pass decision, allowing jurisdictions, states, counties, cities to make their own rules, and many are very quickly moving into increased policing and the ability to cite, arrest, and jail people for sleeping outside. That is the crime, that you're sleeping outside. in a state where we don't have nearly adequate shelter. The effects of these sweeps are myriad. As a physician, I laugh laugh is one word, at the amount of time I spend begging Medi-Cal to refill medicines that, are before the refill date because somebody else in government has just thrown them out. So people lose their medicines. They lose connections to services. So if they had a housing navigator or a case manager, folks don't have phones or anything. And if they had a phone, it was thrown out. And so they were finally developing a relationship with their case manager, and their case manager literally can't find them because they've moved somewhere else. It adds to people's arrest records because people get cited with fines they can't possibly pay. And then when those fines build up, they get jailed. And then they have an arrest record that then is a reason to create a barrier to housing. Landlords are allowed to use that as a reason not to house. So we are going to see a huge increase in this. And what I've been trying to explain to the public and the press is that when you think of who's affected by this is predominantly older adults. Half of those folks engaged in sweeps are in fact people 50 and older. And while they're 50 and older, they really are more like people in their 70s and 80s in the general population. We're hearing from older adults, they can't see, they can't hear. They don't even realize if the place has been told a sweep is coming the next day and they're just woken up in the middle of the night, everything they own is tossed out.
Thank you for that. Donna, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Thank you. Thank you for, this truly disturbing report. It's really sad to hear that. And one of the things that I was looking at, I've been speaking out recently about homelessness, and I think that continues to be under-recognized, but I think was somewhat shown in your data on people who are becoming homeless after age of 50, is that I think many of them were family caregivers.
Yes, we've written about that and talked about it. And I didn't mention it today. It's really common, actually.
Yeah.
And it operates through a couple of ways. What we saw a lot, and we started to see this in Hope Home, and then we found it again in CASPA, is that often what we heard was that people moved in with mom to be mom's caregiver. So they gave up an apartment, they gave up their job, were paid for by IHHS, so had some source of income. And either mom moved into a nursing home or died. And literally overnight, their source of income goes away. But also they're not on the lease. No one is saying, they're saying, oh, you can move in with mom so you can be her caregiver, because we all know, right? IHHS will pay for a certain number of hours a week, but mom needs 24/7 care. And then they're out. I've actually discussed this a little bit with AFSCME and SEIU, who lead and I said to me, I want to test this. Are you guys hearing this too? Because we're hearing it. They're like, oh, we're hearing it from our workers all the time. This is really horrendous, but it's also an opportunity. We, the state, are paying them. We know when the person has been removed. The other thing I'm increasingly concerned about is the clawback we've seen, particularly for Black folks, move into the home that mom owns, the family has owned for years. Mom goes to SNF, paid for by Medicaid, and then it's clawed back to pay the Medicaid bill. And that's why son, who's 52, is displaced into homelessness. So we see both of those things. It's both sudden loss of income, sudden loss of housing. Sometimes they were living with mom anyway, and sometimes they moved in with mom to be her caregiver. I have actually incorporated this in my clinical practice into my end of life planning, because I've started to ask the elders who are facing the end of their life, are you concerned that someone in your household is going to be displaced into homelessness with your death? And it's like Pandora's box. And at least if we know, we can refer people for legal aid to see if there's any form of getting them added to the lease or anything that we can do. We're also seeing the effects of grief. Like most of us, if our parent dies, if we're lucky enough to have a protected job, we get bereavement leave, which is never long enough, but is there. But if you are in this position, there's no bereavement leave, and your income is cut off the day mom dies. That's it. The IHHS payments stop.
Right. Yeah. So, well, thank you. You've made my point, and even for non-IHSS people,
yes,
you'll see in that population, they have this. Becomes the same, because what I was noticing, you had death and illness. I think those are proxies for that caregiving
Exactly.
issue
Exactly.
that's coming up.
And we wrote
And I
about this
think
in
we
the
need to have
Casper
policies
report.
to address that. Yeah.
Absolutely. We wrote about it in Casper, and I've talked to some journalists who've done some nice work on it. I think it's really important and under-recognized, and yet maybe an opportunity to intervene.
Thank you. I think Olivia's hands up. Yeah, yours. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Brenda.
I know you said prevention programs are hard to do, or but I just wondered, have you heard of any promising services, models, programs out there that are targeted to older adults' needs that maybe could be successful in preventing?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. Obviously, Home Safe is a model. Like, we're trying to evaluate it, and the quality of data makes it hard to actually do a rigorous evaluation of like who would have otherwise become homeless, but we have signals that Home Safe is actually getting people at extraordinarily high risk, because they're actually getting a lot of calls from people like, as the sheriff is about to go evict them when there's clearly no place else to go. So that's clearly a high risk individual that we actually need to back it up a bit. We need to get 4 weeks warning and not 1 day warning, but we have signal with Home Safe that they are getting access to people at very, very high risk. The whole problem with prevention is that prevention needs to be effective and efficient. Effective means it needs to be enough of whether it's money, whether it's the right service mix, to work. Because like if you need $10,000 and you give someone $500, you're just sort of throwing good money after bad. But as importantly, it needs to be efficient. It needs to actually identify people who are actually going to become homeless, because believe it or not, there's so many people who are desperately poor, who are doubled up, let's say, who haven't, who actually managed to work it out. Like, people are incredibly resourceful. I think some problems are a lot focus on leaseholders. So you see a lot of like shallow subsidy programs for leaseholders. Actually, the people who've already lost their lease are at much higher risk of homelessness. Like, like you see, and too few identify non-leaseholders. So you see a lot of things saying like, if you can prove you're going to be evicted, what we found in our data is that people who were doubled up or in these non-leaseholding situations had like 1 day warning before, because basically you don't know you're going to be kicked out, right? Things fall apart, and they fall apart really quickly. I think Home Safe has done a pretty good job of identifying high-risk people. In New York, they have models. They have much better data because they have a right to shelter, so they know actually when people are going to become homeless. They have shown that there's no level of risk that is too high. It turns out if you leave it up to frontline case managers, they tend to think that, like, let's say people with behavioral health complexity, like, oh, this isn't going to work, so they don't try, but you're actually much better off giving it to people who are at extraordinarily high risk. You're not going to prevent it in everyone. And that is the other thing, is you have to look at the delta of what would have happened. So whenever someone does, which happens all the time, oh, we did this prevention program and we were 100% successful, nobody became homeless, that is a clear marker to me that they weren't targeting the right people. Because I like to joke, like, if you were to give me $1,000 a month, I can promise you I'm not going to become homeless. And then you would have 100% success rate. So like, whenever anyone tells you that they had 100% success rate, I know that they're giving money to the wrong people. You really want to target people at extraordinarily high risk, and you need to be able to tolerate it not working in some, because that's kind of how you know. New York, they have a whole system called Homebase where they basically have community centers. They make it sort of sticky so that they want to put some barriers up, because that helps separate the people who are at highest risk from not. They have like signs and buses and stuff like, do you think you're going to lose your housing? Come on in. And if you come in, they ask a series of questions that are designed to find what are the highest characteristics. The highest risk characteristic is ever having been homeless before. That is a single best predictor, but there are some other predictors. They give the frontline people a little bit of wiggle room so that if you don't quite make it, but the caseworker has some reason to believe, they're allowed to overrule it. But mostly whether you get resources or not depends on whether you score high enough. The single best predictor is whether you've ever been homeless before. But the other things that work for single adults are things like, do you live in a high area deprivation index census tract? Probably because that is a marker for your social network not having the ability to protect you from becoming from becoming homeless. And as an aside, in Hope Home, I mentioned that we've been following people in and out of homelessness. So 80% of Hope Home participants, they all started homeless, found housing at some point during their time. 50% of those who found housing re-entered homelessness at a median of 1 year. Those are the people we need to get to. That is our single, probably highest risk thing, is people who have, and what are the indicators? If you had a voucher, you didn't become homeless again for the most part. I mean, some people did, but most didn't. We have to find those people, as most people who exit homelessness with no support from the government. But like HMIS is like, oh, they're housed now. They went to live with their brother. Those are the people at highest risk. Those are the older adults that we need to get to. If I had a limited pool of money, I would be putting those older adults who had exited homelessness without any subsidy, finding them and preventing them.
Thank you. Any other questions from the partnership? Dr. Cashel, so I think you mentioned 95% shelter, and I think that was New York. Well,
Yeah.
what's the main purposes of that? Like, what's the main reasons why they're able to shelter so much? Is because those prevention programs compared to California? Or is it too complex?
No. It's not that. It's that there was a lawsuit, which actually they kind of regret, in the late 1970s that guaranteed a right to shelter. So under the state Supreme Court, basically New York City is under sort of a rule that New York City is obligated to provide shelter to anybody who asks. And so as a result, you become homeless, you raise your hand, they have to give you shelter. That sounds great in a way, but it's also been sort of a total disaster in another way, because they basically have these huge warehouses. They spend an amount of money, billions of dollars every year, on sheltering people. People stay sheltered for 10, 15, 20 years in warehouses with 500 other people, and they've put all of their resources into shelter, and they can't pull the resources out to provide housing. In California, we've tried to quietly advocate against that. There are policymakers who want to talk about a right to shelter. We worry that while shelter is probably better, depending on how you design shelter, like non-congregate shelter is very expensive, but probably better than being outside. Congregate shelter, it's a little messier to know how much better it is. It's probably a little better, but not that much better than being outside, depending on the quality and things. We tried to put out models of like the right ratio of shelter to housing. You're starting to see a lot of push for tiny homes and a lot of slippery language, like people calling it housing. Tiny homes, a shack that you buy at Home Depot is not a house, it's a shack. It has some advantages to being outside. It protects you a little bit from the rain. It's a door to lock, so you're less likely to get assaulted. But what I'm really fearful of is some of those programs are now, let's say, going after housing choice vouchers as a way to pay for it. The only reason why those programs work is if there's a permanent exit, right? So you can't put all of our money into those and ignore the permanent exit. Because as I like to say to policymakers, just think about the mental model. If you have a 6-month length of stay, because you have enough housing for people to exit to, that you can move them from there to housing, versus if you have a 2-year length of stay. And in New York, it's like 10 years, but you have a 2-year length of stay versus a 6-month length of stay. You have overnight quadrupled your shelter resources, right? Because it's not like someone uses a shelter and then it closes. Like if you can put 4 different people in that shelter over the same 2 years, you have effectively quadrupled your shelter capacity. So there's some right ratio that we need to find between shelter and housing, because the amount of shelter you have is directly related to the amount of housing exits you can make. Every person you exit to permanent housing, you've opened up that shelter bed. All Home put forward a 1-to-4 ratio. For every unit of shelter you build, you should create 2 units of permanent housing and 4 units of prevention. Some people think it should be 1, 3, 6, but we need to have a model for how much money we invest in shelter versus how much we put the money out. Because you see, for instance, Santa Clara raised a lot of money for through a measure for housing. San Jose is just pulling that money out of housing and putting it into shelter. That is ultimately a losing game, because they're never going to be able to create enough shelter. It's not like one group of people, it's people entering homelessness all the time. You've got to keep the exits up.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kushel. I don't see any of their hands, so appreciate your time.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for
That was a great
having me.
discussion.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Take care. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
All right, so moving ahead, our next agenda items, Evan will provide updates related to the data dashboard for aging. We had a discussion with some of you a few weeks ago. Just want to follow up on that. So Evan, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, quick mic check. Can you hear me okay, Ross?
Yeah. Could you speak again? Actually, it was kind of faint.
Can you hear me okay? Is it
Yeah,
soft?
I think I can hear you. Can everyone else hear Evan?
If you
That should
speak
get-
a little louder, it'll be awesome.
Okay, I will speak as loud as I can.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Evan Wallace. I'm a research data specialist at CDII. I manage the data dashboard for aging, or the DDA, which is, if you haven't been there, it's a collection of public dashboards that help track the progress of the NPA. And we've made a few updates recently that we're happy to have an opportunity to share with you all. So on next slide. The big one is that the DDA recently moved to a new web address. So the page itself should appear similar to people, but it just lives in a different place now. But more importantly for us is that because it's now on a CDA server, it enables the department to make faster and larger changes to the DDA. So we can basically change any part of it now because it's all in-house. We've made some of those changes already. We wanted to share some of them with you. And also solicit some feedback to hear about what other things you'd like to see in the DDA to make it as helpful as possible. Next slide. So most of these updates focus around usability improvements. We heard some feedback in the past saying it wasn't the most user-friendly thing to use. We also saw some web analytics saying that people were on average spending less than a minute on these pages, probably 40 seconds, I think was the number I heard. And so what we decided to do was really just optimize those short experiences. And so we've implemented summary pages. We've reduced the number of decisions the user has to make to be able to see stuff. We're implementing a consistent layout so that you know what data to expect to see on the DDA. Generally, that's going to be the main metric, how that number varies by population groups, and how that number varies by location. And all of these things are going to contribute to helping. So even if you only stay on our pages for 40 seconds, you're still going to get some information out of it. You'll still get a take-home message. So those, in general, that's what we're doing here. Some more specific things we've done is we've added a new dashboard, the NPA Key Outcomes dashboard. That's highlights some of the work that CADRP has done over the last 6 months to a year. And there's also a demographic profile of older adults on the DDA that we've updated recently. So how do you get to the DDA? We can type in the address yourself. Make sure you update your bookmark if you have a bookmark. But if you're on the main NPA website, which is npa.aging.ca.gov, at the top, at the header, there's an NPA progress dropdown, and the DDA is the first link there. A link is also peppered throughout the body of the website, but this is the most consistent way to get to it. Next slide. That link will take you to the DDA homepage, and among other things, it's like the navigation hub for the DDA. So the NPA has 5 goals. The DDA has a page for each goal. And so those are the blue rectangles you'll see on the page on the left there. Another function of this page is that because it's the page that everybody goes to first, it's an opportunity for us to highlight, to show people data. Recent work we've done that's come out of CADRP, or if a particularly timely issue, this is a place for us to show data about that issue. And it also is a place for us to put data about frequently asked questions. If we get a lot of questions about, what is the, how many older adults have this, how many older adults have that, this is a place for us to put that information in a central place. So if we zoom in on a couple of these, that first dashboard you see, that's our key outcomes dashboard. You see the navigation panel on the left. There's one for homelessness, one for psychological distress. There's 2 more to follow soon: the direct care workforce and caregiver burden. These again came out of these are priority issues that we're tracking that CADRP recommended. They generally all follow the same structure, where there's a main metric at the top that's just kind of like the baseline, and how the history of the metric and how we're doing. And then you'll find additional information at the bottom. There's an equity panel, which is the one on the left there. This particular one has our equity index on it, which is a kind of a new thing we're trying. It's a different conversation really, but it's generally a way to summarize equity data into a score, where a lower number means it's less equitable and a higher number means it's more equitable. But you also get the middle panel, which just shows you how this number varies by geography. And we have potential drivers on the right. So these are potential other data points that might have a relationship with the main thing we're tracking. The drivers are a fluid box. So as we do more research and find new, better drivers, as long as data is available, we can swap them out here. Next slide. This is our new demographic profile dashboard. We get these common questions about just what's the general makeup of older adults. A lot of them will be answered here. It's a combination of Department of Finance data, American Community Survey data, and California Health Interviews Survey data. It's about the present day and maybe a few years in the past. I think it goes back to 2018, 2017. If you're interested in projections and going in the future, that's the other tab there on the navigation panel, population projections. That takes the Department of Finance population projections, which go out to 2060, and puts it in a format that's easier to digest. You can see like demographic shifts and stuff like that. So that is the DDA homepage. If you were to click on one of those blue rectangles at the top, it would take you to a goal page, which is the next slide. It looks like this. This is the goal page for goal 5. And generally what these do is they just list the metrics that we're tracking for each goal and strategy. There is also more detail about each one of those goals. If you're interested, you have to click into it. And we also want to add context to these metrics by integrating the active policy initiatives that are supposed to affect the metric. So let's go next slide. We'll zoom in on one of these. So this is goal 5 strategy. Goal 5 has 3 strategies in it. And so that's why you see 3 dashboards here, 1 per strategy. This bottom one is strategy C, which is protection from poverty and hunger. These are the metrics we're tracking. We're tracking 4 metrics. Those are the latest values for the metrics, and the history is right next to them. Every strategy will have this homepage on it. So just at a glance, this is what's in here. If it's something interesting you can add more, you can click more detail on the left. So if you were to click food insecurity, that's the next slide here. It would load more information about food insecurity. Generally, our dashboards are going to look like this. We have your main metric at the top, kind of your pull quote, if you will. 30% of low-income adults were experiencing food insecurity. And then we'll show you how the things you should expect to see in the DDA, how that number varies by population group and how it varies by location. And so there's some filters kind of in the middle there, a topic, a year you can change. It didn't really show up on the screenshot, but so you can change the topic from race to, say poverty status or language spoken, or there's some SOGI data in some of these. So you can just see that the bars are larger for some populations and lower for others. And then the map shows you the geography that's available. You can see how it varies there. You can see Stanislaus is a lot darker than, say, something like San Diego. But that's the general layout of our new dashboards. But say you wanted to say, oh, this is great, but what are the active policy initiatives that might affect these numbers? And so we've tried to integrate the initiatives. There you go, perfect timing. If you click on the MPA initiatives button, you see the active initiatives for this 2-year cycle in the MPA. And you can see for strategy C, there's one about expanding CalFresh, and there's one about optimizing meal service programs. And so you can kind of see the related policy things that are happening with these metrics. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the last one for me. So what's next for the DDA? There are 6 total pages, including the homepage of the DDA. We implemented the redesign for 3 of them. So we have to update the other 3. We will continue to add additional years of data to all of these dashboards. That's a core principle of the DDA, is that it's continually updated. So we'll continue doing that. The equity score, which you saw first debuted on that key outcomes dashboard there. Once we get a little more feedback on that, some more eyes on it, and see how it's received, we would like to implement that across the DDA on our other measures where it's appropriate, obviously. And then we've had recent discussions about integrating some qualitative data to kind of improve our ability to tell data stories, or stories with data. And the catalyst for all these updates and all these changes is feedback. So we're actively looking for feedback. Thank you to the CADRIC members who we had a DDA feedback session not long ago. That was great for us. Got a lot of good notes out of that. So we'll continue to do that. We'll try trying to come up with a formalized way of getting feedback. I don't know if it's a survey or what, but anyway, we're actually looking at and look for more details on how to do. But that's an overview of the DDA, how it looks now. If you haven't looked at it in a while, please check it out and let us know what you think. We do love feedback.
Thanks, Evan. Great job. Any questions for Evan? DDA related questions? Underlying data, Evan, could folks access that, like the actual, like the finance data, for example, or their other data? I know there's quite a bit of data sources. How would folks go about accessing that? Would they email us, or is there another option for them?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways. If you have Tableau, you can download it and download the workbooks and extract it that way. You can see the source data when you do that. If you don't, we're working on other ways of getting that to you. We have like companion files that we can either post alongside the dashboards, or there's open data portals where we can post data sets of the underlying data just to make it more accessible. Right?
Good. I'm excited about this. And there's so much we could do with this. Partnership members, I mean, this is opens up a lot of opportunities for us. I don't see any hands, Evan, so you're off the hook, I think. Thank you so much for the presentation. I appreciate it. So in our last agenda item, already kind of cruising through this. So I'm excited about this agenda item. We've been talking about the LGBTQIA study for a while now. We have initial findings to share with you today, so I'm really excited about that. So Angie, I'm going to hand it over to you. Or Bella, do you have a question? See the spotlight. Okay, sorry. So I think Angie's going to go over a few slides related
yes.
to the LGBTQ study.
Carol misread Angie for Isabella. So
Hey, that happens, Carol.
hello, Angie. I'm going to spotlight you. Hold on for 2 secs. Good morning.
Hi, good morning, everyone. No worries about that at all. So I'm going to just share some preliminary findings and also contextualize them a little bit within larger research that we have with this population. All right. So first, let me give you some overviews about the demographics of the survey respondents. So we had a mix of age in terms of folks from 50 to 70 and above. In terms of race, it wasn't as diverse as we had hoped, but this was the breakdown. It was about a little less than 80% white and 22% people of color. And then in terms of transgender, it was a little less than 90% of folks who identify as cisgender and 11% who identify as transgender or gender expansive. And that statistic is consistent nationally as well. And then we did have, in terms of quality of life, a large percentage of folks reported that they had a high quality of life, which is inconsistent with national data. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then we also had one thing that is more consistent, though, is that there was lower quality of life reported among people of color and transgender and gender expansive folks. And then while it's not reported here, we expect there's still folks doing data analysis and looking at different subgroups, but we expect that to be true. We anticipate that will also be true for women as well, assuming that is consistent with other research, but we're still digging into the data to determine that. And then just a couple of notes for high quality of life. So there's research, national research that has controlled for income, education, and age, as well as sexual orientation and gender identity. That's found a much lower percentage. And so that's additional data collection or data analysis that's occurring within the team now. And so that's just to sort of contextualize that piece. And then next slide, please. And then for physical health, we had 23% reported physical health as fair or poor. 17% are living with HIV. And again, we're going to do more sort of analysis to sort of understand that and contextualize that a little bit more within the data, within subgroups. Mental health, 49% experienced a traumatic event in their lifetime. 24% had symptoms consistent with PTSD. 11% reported serious thoughts of suicide in the past year, and this was higher among transgender and gender expansive folks, which was at 16%. And that also is nationally in some of the other larger research studies, specifically looking at transgender folks, that statistic, our statistic is on the little bit of the lower side. And so we're trying to contextualize that and look at different aspects in terms of income and other aspects of sort of intersecting positionalities to understand that a little bit better. And then the other thing I'll say about that, well, actually, let me go on to the next slide, and then I'll add a couple of more notes too. In terms of financial status and vulnerability, 26% reported financial insecurity or concerns. 1 in 5 worried about having enough money for nutritious meals. And then in terms of folks working past 67, we had 21% who identified as cisgender, 26% who identified as transgender or gender expansive, 39% from the MENA region, and 32% who identified as Black or African American who were working past age 67. So more folks of color, and then trans folks as well. And then next slide, please. We also had some measures reporting discrimination and safety. 79% did not report to authorities, which is pretty consistent with other data that we know. 30% of transgender and gender expansive respondents reported discomfort with first responders knowing gender identity and sex assigned at birth, which is also pretty consistent with other data. And then, and also highlights the need for culturally responsive services. And then in terms of persistent discrimination, 27% reported being treated unfairly or discriminated against in the past 12 months. And this was higher among people of color, which was at 41%, and also higher among transgender and gender expansive folks, which was at 49%. And again, that's consistent with other data as well. Next slide, please. So actually, before I go to recommendations, I'll just add that this is preliminary. There's still a lot of data analysis that's occurring. I know the team is doing a lot of analysis to sort of look at, to control for additional variables, and also to look at subgroups within the larger LGBTQ plus aging community of respondents. But the other thing I'll note too is that, and again, we're still at the preliminary stages of data analysis and interpretation really, but some of the findings were consistent with national data and some are not. And so we're still trying to make sense of that. And one thing could be that some of the services and programs that are happening in California that are being funded and sort of emerging may be actually providing avenues for thriving and resilience in ways that are helping in terms of quality of life. It could also be that the sample, is overrepresented in terms of white. And then also this is not reflective. This is a little bit more aggregate. It doesn't represent, there's still analysis that's occurring that shows sort of different subgroups and different findings for different subgroups. So that I'll put in terms of to contextualize the findings. But then in terms of initial recommendations, we have a few, of course there's many, but these are the ones we're going to highlight here, is to improve access, inclusivity, and safety of service for LGBTQI plus older adults to promote healthy aging. And I'll add healthy and equitable aging. To increase social and economic support for LGBTQIA plus older adults. To understand and address disparities among transgender and gender expansive older adults and older adults of color. To measure policy outcomes and improve data collection among LGBTQI plus older adult communities. Next slide, please. And then lessons learned. There's always lessons learned when you do a big project like this. And one was effective community engagement is critical. This project involved a large group of community partners, which helped us get a really strong, really large number of respondents. And so that was really helpful. And community rapport building takes a lot of time, especially in hard to reach communities. And so that's another piece that's a really important lesson learned. Collecting detailed and representative data requires careful planning and execution. And some of these are things that sort of we know, but just important lessons learned to sort of reiterate as well. Designing an inclusive survey that reflects the diversity of LGBTQI plus community is essential. And significant disparities exist within LGBTQIA plus older adults particularly among people of color and transgender and gender expansive individuals. I think another important lesson learned that relates to the data that we just reported on is that the population is really heterogeneous. It's not a homogeneous population. And so that means that there are going to have to be targeted supports, targeted funds, targeted priorities that are targeted in different ways for subgroups within the larger LGBTQ plus aging community. And so that's, I think, reflected in the data that we're seeing as well. Next slide, please. So conclusions and next steps. So one key conclusion, of course, is that California's LGBTQIA plus communities cannot achieve their potential for healthy aging unless specific disparities and discrimination are addressed across an array of services. The initial survey documented areas of need, important to conduct survey on a periodic basis going forward. And then also data collection should continue and be more robust. I think there was, we had a really strong response rate, and yet we would love to actually extend it beyond to get a more representative sample throughout California. So the study team is working on finalizing outputs for distribution. Focus groups throughout the state are building on this data. So we're using really a sequential mixed methods, I would say modified sequential mixed methods approach by examining the needs of targeted groups identified as hard to reach and underrepresented. And we're employing kind of an intra-group model of focus group research. So that's why we're focusing on hard to reach populations within these focus groups that were included to some degree in the survey, and yet we really want to dive deeper into what we learned from the survey and also what maybe is missing from the survey too. And so we're going to do that through the focus groups that are starting this month and continuing really through October. And we have currently 8 focus groups scheduled this month in August, and have a number of other ones that will occur in the fall. So I'm happy to answer any questions that folks may have.
Thanks, Angie. The focus group, that's so exciting. The focus groups are built upon this survey, fill in those gaps. I'm really looking forward to what comes out of that.
Great.
Questions for Angie? Olivia, go ahead. Hop right in.
Yeah, I just have a question, just a process timeline question of when, final outputs like reports and data will be released, like if you have an estimated timeline on that.
So my understanding is that the team, we have a number of folks on the team have created or are in the process of creating a really robust dissemination strategy that will have, I think, all those dates. Ross may have a better sense of that, but
yeah, we're still working through it. I think this summer, sorry to be so broad, like probably next month, the final report's going to come out. We're still working on it. We're getting really close, Olivia. So I don't have an exact date, but I'm thinking like sometime in August. And we're gonna have there's gonna be more outputs after that. The final report will come out first. We'll have other reports and outputs, not reports necessarily, fact sheets, infographics, things of that nature. Does that help? Okay, thanks.
Yes, thank you.
Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Ross. And Angie, thank you again for a wonderful overview, and you've been doing amazing work on this. Just to share with to build on that, compliment Ross and the department for a thoughtful communication process that will continue, a combination of the statewide survey and Angie's wonderful results. We're looking at the next 12, 18 months of continuous use of the data, continuous communication on multiple levels, starting with the state and the department doing that, but we're also aligning multiple conference presentations to use this. And at the Commission on Aging, we're undertaking a review of potential legislation. So again, thank you again, Angie and Ross, for your great leadership on this.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. Any other questions, comments? All right, thank you, Angie. Appreciate it.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, take care. So Carol, I think I'm gonna hand it over to you for public comment now. I think you're on mute.
Hello, and thank you. We're going to go ahead and put the slide up and offer our public comment period. attendees by phone, please press *9 on your dial pad. It will raise the hand icon, and if you're on Zoom, you can click the raised hand icon. And we're glad to take your comment at this time. We've had a lot of interesting information. And the slides will be posted at CalHHS on the CATR webpage after a week or so after this presentation, including the recording. So we have Patty. I'm going to unmute your line. Go ahead, Patty.
Thanks so much, Carol. And this has been a terrific presentation. I want to thank all of the presenters and the research behind it. I'm going to focus on the presentation by Margot Kuchel and want to just lift up her policy recommendations and talk about how they are aligned with the Master Plan for Aging housing initiatives related to preventing and ending homelessness. And just I would like to talk about how the research is going to go forward to really identify those key homeless prevention strategies, which is initiative number 2 for the 23-24 strategic initiatives related to housing. And related to that, and I know, Ross, you have done some work on this, how we are going to move the homelessness curve by focusing on prevention, and how the data dashboard can really show us that we're making some headway in creating both, as Dr. Kuchel says, efficient and effective prevention strategies. Thank you.
Patty, may I ask you to state your name and your affiliation?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I was among friends.
You are, you absolutely are.
My name is Patty Prunhuber, and I am the Director of Housing Advocacy at Justice and Aging, and really appreciate the partnership of CDA on these housing initiatives.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your comment, Patty. If you'd like to make a public comment, please raise your hand now. Or of course, at any time after this meeting, you may send a written comment to our Engage email box, engage, ENGAGE @aging.ca.gov. And Ross, I think that we have no more comments.
Okay.
Again,
Thank you, everyone.
can send a comment to our Engage email box.
Thank you, Carol. This is our 3rd CATR meeting already this year, so I just want to thank everyone. The collaboration. It's just a pleasure working with everyone. I hope to see you all October 8th, the day of action. If not, we'll connect afterward, and please reach out with anything. Have a great weekend. Thank you all. Take care.